Here we go. So we're starting Leviticus today, and very, very different book. You know, if Genesis and Exodus really were mostly stories and stories that gave us a tremendous amount of inspiration, people and events that we could learn from, miracles. At the end of Exodus, there were a lot of chapters about the tabernacle. Here we are taking this tabernacle thing much further and going very deeply into issues having to do with sacrifices on the one hand and ritual purity on the other. Those are the main subjects that we see in Leviticus. And so today what I really want to do is kind of give an introduction and perhaps discuss a bit on the whole issue of sacrifices. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think of sacrifices, I kind of go, ew, you know? Now, I'm not a vegetarian by any means. I like my steak. But first of all, I think part of it is the changes happened to us over even, let's say, 50 or 100 years ago, certainly 100 years ago. When people eat meat today, chicken or meat or whatever, typically you go to the supermarket and you buy a piece of something that is wrapped in cellophane, and it's all very, you know, neat, clean, and you don't necessarily see the animal when you are buying your neatly wrapped package of roast or whatever. So there was, of course, not that long ago, if you wanted to have meat, you slaughtered it, you know, and if you were a farmer, you would raise these animals and then you would slaughter them. And so I would assume there was a different sensibility about this sort of thing of, you know, killing animals and what it does for you. But I would also say that today, in the way we view things, I think most of us, when we think of worshiping God, when we think of talking to God, when we think of praying to God, I don't think any of us as a natural course would just say, oh, the best way that I can serve God right now is to go take an animal and slaughter it, you know, and take the blood and wipe the blood on the corners of the altar, and burn the animal and maybe eat part of the animal, you know, have a little barbecue on some of it and the rest of it, you know. So, you know, maybe this is a good opportunity for us to, you know, do any of you have any comment right now before we even launch into this? I've raised these questions. When you think about sacrifices, how do you relate to this whole thing? Maybe if any of you want to just make a few comments before we get, you know, really into the subject, I'd love to hear.
Well, from reading them, a lot of them were free will offerings. There was, you know, most of the offerings was to offer, you know, free will up to God. You know, they weren't for sin. It was just as a pleasing aroma, just to say, you know, everything we have comes from you, and this is, I don't know, so just an act of love.
But do you think that, do you relate to this as being a way of expressing your love? That's really the question.
Well, I guess, as you said, nowadays we can't, but I can understand why. I mean, the sacrifices are going to be returning when the temple's rebuilt, so we have to get used to it.
All right, well, that's a good question. Let's keep that question in mind. Will we be returning to sacrifices? Okay, anybody else have something they want to share, or you know, any kind of, yes, please, Ivan.
Just one thing that struck me in the past when I was reading through the sacrifices in Scripture was the fact that the smell of the sacrifice pleased God, and that struck me deeply. You know, I was very surprised, and it came the first time I read that. I found it was really unexpected. Powerful.
Okay, that's a good point. What does this mean when we talk about a smell? pleasing God. Okay, what is this doing for God? I think this is definitely, an important point. Okay.
I think it pleases him for, the children being obedient out of love, not because I have to do it, but because I want to do it. So it pleases him.
It pleases him because we're doing what it is he wants us to do.
Yeah, like bringing the sacrifices out of gratitude and not necessarily, having it's about your heart, not just doing things because you're told to do it.
Okay. Okay.
I just want to add.
Yeah.
This is Diane. I just want to add a thought. I don't believe we'll be doing the animal sacrifices because, as you taught us and others have as well, God is in us. So our life is a living sacrifice to him. And in Leviticus 23, I believe it is, there was only one that he said we would continue. And I think that was the Feast of Tabernacles in the fall.
Well, the Leviticus 23 doesn't say anything about holidays stopping. That may be an interpretation.
That's what I'm saying. I'm sorry, go ahead.
It's not an interpretation. Leviticus 23 has we will be doing that another time, but that has a whole list of holidays. But it lists them all. It doesn't say about any of them that they're going to go out of style.
Okay. I misread that then. I
thought
it was only one. Okay.
All right. So anyway, yes. Want somebody else?
Yes. For me, looking at the sacrifices, as Judy said, we are a living sacrifice. And again, I don't know people's background, but from a Christian perspective, I look at the sacrifices and I see the multidimensional sacrifice of Jesus Christ, how he pleased the Father, and gave up everything for obedience, and the meal offering, his daily life, and the sin offering and the trespass offering. So for me, it's a way of understanding in a deeper level what it meant for Jesus to die.
Okay, well, clearly, from a Jewish point of view, we don't relate the sacrifices here to Jesus, but I am well aware that this is a Christian perspective. And from a Christian perspective, I think the first order of business is to figure out what it is God is trying to tell us in Leviticus. Because whether you're Jewish or Christian, you got to first go to the source and see what it is that's going on here. So, first of all, if we start at the very beginning, I think I referenced this a bit last week, but I just want to say this again because it is a critical introduction to the whole idea. Last week, we ended with the end of Exodus, and if you remember the very last verses of Exodus, we see Moses completing the tabernacle. The cloud of glory, God's presence, comes down to rest on the tabernacle, and then we have that very amazing sentence that Moses, this is verse 35, and Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud of glory of God rested and filled the tabernacle. There is a wonderful classic commentary, that connects that situation with the beginning of Leviticus. Leviticus begins, the Lord called to Moses. And what I think is a beautiful, beautiful thought, this is a direct continuation. In other words, Moses is standing before this tabernacle in awe of God's presence, feeling unable to enter. And then in Leviticus, God beckons Moses to enter. Now, if we take this beyond the literal meaning of these few words, I think what we see here in the book of Leviticus is God not only beckoning us to enter the temple, but he's giving us the recipe. He's basically saying the way to meet God at the tabernacle is through these rules of purity and the rules of sacrifice. And these, of course, are the rules that lay the foundation for how Israel will come to the tabernacle and how they will worship God. So that, I think, is something that is very important to keep in mind. I believe that the sacrifices are a tool. They are not the sacrifice itself, the technical aspects of the sacrifice are not what is important. It is what the sacrifices are supposed to accomplish. And it is the tool that God has given us in order to worship him. And I will remind you that later on, when the nation of Israel gets all corrupt and problematic, and we have the prophets, particularly Jeremiah, for example, that comes to the nation with tremendous criticism to the nation for all kinds of moral and religious things that they do wrong, okay? And what does he say? This is just one example. In Jeremiah 7, verse 4, he says, don't put your trust in falsehoods. Those who say, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. Okay? And he goes on to say, no, you have to improve your ways. You have to become righteous again. You have to look out for the stranger and the orphan and the widow. And you have to don't murder people, etc. Okay? What is it that he's saying? Don't rely on those falsehoods, those people that say the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. Because in society, and unfortunately what developed throughout the first temple period, you had people that believed that the sacrifices were like a magic potent, okay? If they just brought the sacrifice, everything was fine, okay? Actually, to a certain degree, this reflects a pagan attitude. One of the major differences between pagan sacrifice and Israelite sacrifice or Jewish sacrifice or biblical sacrifice. In a pagan world, a sacrifice is used to bribe a god. That's how they saw it. In other words, I have to get the God onto my side, and I'm going to bring him something that he likes to smell. Okay, let's remember what we talked about. The smell is pleasing. He likes to smell. He's going to get great pleasure out of this. And, if you've read any of the ancient mythologies, whether it's Greek mythology or Babylonian mythology, gods are very selfish and easily, tempted individuals. That's a pagan idea. What Jeremiah is saying here is that it's not the technicality of the sacrifice. If you don't put your heart in it, and if you don't see the sacrifice as a vehicle to get close to God, you miss the point. And I would connect this, and there's other places where he says, God doesn't need your sacrifices. And so I would connect this also with this comment that was made, pleasing to God. What is pleasing to God? And I think some of you, I don't remember who said what, but one of you said that the whole point of this is to show that we are obedient to God, that we're doing this out of our free will because we want to do what God wants. So I don't believe that it is the smoke itself that's pleasing to God. I think it's the act of bringing the sacrifice in obedience to God, coming from the right attitude, that is what is pleasing to God. So that the smoke just becomes a symbol of this idea. Okay, so I would say this is the basic idea behind the sacrifices. Now, one of you said that you think that sacrifices are mostly free will offerings. Well, there's a combination. There are free will offerings of people, something wonderful happened to them, they experienced a miracle, they had a baby, whatever. And so then there's this idea that they're going to come to God and bring a free will offering as a individual, expression of gratitude. But the vast majority of sacrifices that we're reading about at the beginning of Leviticus are required sacrifices. Some of them are public sacrifices. They're sacrifices that the priests themselves are bringing every morning and every evening on the holidays, on Sabbath. These are sacrifices that are supposed to represent all of Israel. When they bring them on behalf of the public, on behalf of the whole nation, and they're required. They're set at different times in different places. And then there are, of course, sin offerings of various types, and then there are, of course, the free will offerings. So the free will offerings are given. You can do whatever you want, but then you follow the rules of how to bring in what to bring. But these other ones, the sin offerings and the public offerings, are offerings that are mandated. On the other hand, let's pay attention to verse 2 in Leviticus, okay, where God speaks to Moses and he's giving the initial instructions. How does he introduce the whole idea? When a person will bring a sacrifice to God, he should do so from the animal, from a cattle, from a beef, from the sheep. He should bring his sacrifice. So in other words, it starts with a when, not you must bring a sacrifice, but when you bring your sacrifice, this is how you do it. Now, there's no question, I'm not here to say that the whole sacrifice thing is voluntary. But to me, I'm reading in that sentence, when you bring a sacrifice, that there is a built-in assumption that man wants to bring a sacrifice. And in fact, what I want to share with you today is an approach to the whole idea of sacrifices that was most famous for is a medieval scholar, a Jewish scholar named Maimonides. You may have heard of him. There are Jewish hospitals named Maimonides. And the reason that is because Maimonides was not only a brilliant Bible and Talmud scholar, he was an expert in Jewish law. He was also a physician. And not just any physician, he was a court physician. He was originally from Spain and then ended up in Egypt. And so he was he was also a philosopher. Okay, so he was an amazingly brilliant man. He wasn't, I wouldn't call him modern times, but he certainly was already living in a time when sacrifices seemed a bit odd, okay? And so he was asking this question, what is the purpose of these sacrifices? Why do we have sacrifices? And he basically, as part of I would say a more widespread attitude of Maimonides, he said that the sacrifices themselves were there because God realized that the nation of Israel, at the time of the Exodus from Egypt, was very much influenced and immersed in pagan worship. Now, that some of them actually were involved with pagan worship. We don't know what all these people were doing all these years in Egypt and what they were influenced by. But this is the culture that they were aware of. This is the nature of their culture, which is pagan. Okay, and pagan worship included sacrifice. I would refine this a little further and say, even if we don't talk about pagan worship, if we go back to the very beginning of Genesis, where there is no pagan worship initially, if we look at Cain and Abel, if we look at Noah, these are people who certainly are not involved in pagan worship. And yet, as a natural thing, when they want to express appreciation to God, they bring a sacrifice. It can be a sacrifice that is of a more vegetarian nature, and could be an animal sacrifice, but they bring a sacrifice. And they did not yet get any commandments Leviticus hadn't come around yet, right? So nobody commanded them to do that. And so if you look at these ideas, basically what is being said, that in that time, in the time of the Bible, it was a most natural thing to serve God, any God, whether it's the God of Israel or a pagan God. The most natural way to serve God would be to bring a sacrifice of some kind. And therefore, what basically is happening here in Leviticus is that you're taking a people and introducing them to the God of Israel for the first time in an organized way. They're at Revelation and Sinai. First of all, they witnessed all the miracles from Egypt. Then they were at Sinai, where they actually heard God's voice and received the 10 Commandments, after which Moses gets all these other laws and he brings to them. These laws themselves represent in many, many ways a huge departure from the laws that were known at that time in other cultures, not only in the sense of they're not pagan, but it's also a huge departure in many other ways, creating a new idea of morality, okay, that didn't exist before. And the idea here is that if you're going to take a nation and completely change everything they're familiar with and change the way they're supposed to worship and what they're supposed to believe, then it's so much simpler if you use the tools of worship that they are most familiar with. And since the tools of worship that they would be most familiar with would be sacrifice, it's something that they would have felt very, very comfortable with. It is logical to say, okay, we can keep the same tools, but first of all, we are going to give very definite rules. So there's only certain kinds of animals you can bring as a sacrifice and not others. Later on in Leviticus, we'll learn about animals that are pure and animals that are not pure. So there are different rules involved in what animals you can bring and what you can't. There's actually also a theory, and this is also Maimonides puts forth, this is one of his ideas, that some of the animals that actually we are commanded to bring as a sacrifice, whether it be a cow or a calf or whatever, or a sheep, these are, or birds, the different kinds of things that we're told that we bring. These, especially when we talk about the sheep and the calf and the cow or the ox, these were actual idols in Egypt and in other parts of the ancient world. So in a way, by bringing them as a sacrifice, you are you're bringing other things than what those cultures used to bring, and you're kind of slaughtering the God itself. I'm not sure if that this was his theory. I don't know if that actually holds up in modern archaeological studies and how they would have viewed some of these animals. But bottom line, what Maimonides is saying is that this is a vehicle to help the nation of Israel transition from a primarily pagan society to worshiping God in a way that would be most acceptable and most palatable. One of the problems, though, with this theory, and many, many scholars have combated it and disagreed with it, because they're saying if that is the case, what you're actually saying is that there's no intrinsic value to the sacrifices themselves, but that they are only there because it's a convenient vehicle to a people that they would relate it to at that time, which means two things. Number one, would Scripture have gone into such detail with so many laws having to do with sacrifices when it was just a way to combat a particular way of looking at things at a particular time? That's number one. And number two, essentially what this also means is there an independent value to sacrifices, or it is just was seen as the best way for a time? Second issue is, will we then have sacrifices in the future? Now, one of you mentioned that we are, Jewish faith. We assume that there will be, not only that Messiah will come, but that there will be a third temple. He will rebuild the temple, and we will reinstitute those same sacrifices and again follow the rules of Leviticus. Is that really going to happen? If we're saying that the sacrifices themselves were fitting a particular time and a particular mentality, then maybe we have to find a new way to worship God when the temple is reestablished. So I may say that the jury is still out on all of these questions, but the few answers and a few ways that this is discussed, I wanted to share with you. First of all, this idea of an intrinsic value to sacrifices. There are commentators who have said that if it's in the Bible, it has to be eternal. And therefore, the sacrifices themselves have to come back to us. But that there is an intrinsic value to them that we cannot, at this point in time, we don't really understand. Perhaps a mystical message or something about them that perhaps we're just not able to understand right now. But when Messiah comes, we will be able to understand it better. Now, another thought that's related to that refers to Isaiah 11. Okay, Isaiah chapter 11 is a messianic chapter. There's a lot of beautiful verses there. Just want to read you one. Where'd it go? Isaiah 11, verse 19, okay? And here, this is a verse that I remember we had to learn it by heart when I was a kid. It's a beautiful, beautiful verse. And on that day, no, it's not that. Let's see, 19, I'm on the wrong one. 11, 19, why don't I have 19? Oh, here it is. Not 19, 9, excuse me. Isaiah 11, verse 9. Nothing evil or vile shall be done on my sacred mountain, for the land shall be filled with knowledge of God as the water fills the sea. Water fills the sea. Of course, the whole idea, water totally encompasses the sea. It fills it. There's no such thing as a wall in the middle of the sea and then there's empty land. By definition, the water covers the entire sea. And this is a beautiful image to talk about that we will have so much greater knowledge of God. And it's specified here that the focus of this will be my holy mountain. In other words, there will no more be corruption or any kind of bad deeds going on, emanating from or focused on the Temple Mount, in the temple, because we will have such knowledge of God. And this idea is then taken to mean, in some ways, that we will have such knowledge of God that we will understand the sacrifices. And therefore, when we come and do the sacrifices, they will be, something that we naturally understand and connect to. However, there is also a view that says we will not have sacrifices. That we will, that basically, they look at Maimonides saying that, well, it's coming from pagan worship, and we don't have those inclinations anymore. We're not looking to worship trees and stones. We have other problems. Well, our biggest challenges come from secular ideology and secular beliefs or disbeliefs rather than from some competing belief. And certainly when we think about how do we most naturally want to worship God, we're not thinking in terms of sacrifices. We're thinking in terms of words. We're thinking in terms of feelings. We're thinking in terms of perhaps other kinds of experiences, but we're not thinking in terms of sacrifices. The problem when we go in that, and so therefore the idea being, it's possible Messiah comes, there will be a whole different way of expressing ourselves. That kind of goes hand in hand with this idea of a different knowledge of God. What does the word sacrifice mean? The word in Hebrew, korban, actually comes from three different actually meanings. One is sacrifice, hakrava in Hebrew. You sacrifice yourself. But another one is kirva, which means closeness. Now, the word closeness, by the way, is the same root is for a relative. Okay, who's a relative of yours? Is somebody you have a close blood relationship with. The sacrifices themselves are there to, number one, represent your willingness to sacrifice. I am willing to sacrifice myself. If I could, I would kill myself, give my life for you, God. Okay, but God doesn't want you to give your life. So you're giving the life of an animal to represent the type of sacrifice you personally would be willing to do as a representative. It's also this idea of you want to be close. You want it to be a representation or symbol of how close you want to feel. You want to come close to God. Okay, and this, by the way, is very interesting because if we talked about how at the end of Exodus, Moses felt removed. He didn't know how to come in to the tabernacle. And then God beckons to him. He's giving Moses and the nation of Israel the sacrifices as a way to feel close to God. We have to feel the awe and we have to feel the distance, but yet through the sacrifices, we will be able to feel close. So the question is, will there be other ways to feel close? Or will these sacrifices themselves, will we have some kind of a connection to sacrifices? And that will be the best way we can do it. One thing I will just end with this, okay? Part of the conversation that goes on in Jewish thought about whether or not we will have sacrifices and what the meaning of sacrifices is, there's a huge hesitation there about saying something that is in the Bible will one day not be relevant, okay? Now, there were precedents in the past where certain things that are written in the Bible were not later practiced in exactly the same way. Much more technical things, okay? I'll give you one example. The Bible tells us an eye for an eye, when somebody takes out an eye, that person should have his eye removed. That was never, ever implemented because it was seen to be symbolic of something, okay? Now, and there are other things that actually changed a little bit. But we respond to the idea of changing something in the Bible with great hesitation because it's a very slippery slope. Okay. And basically, if we are going to change something, it has to be because we got a message, we got a prophecy, we have a word from God that this is meant to be taken in a more symbolic way, or the details of this can change. And I think for that reason, people are very hesitant to say, oh yeah, no more sacrifices, because they don't want to create a situation where they're saying, we as human beings, we can just decide this we like and this we don't like. That's a very dangerous situation. So I'll just end this with my own thoughts. I do believe that it's very possible we will not go back to sacrifices. I believe that humanity today is not the same type of human being. I mean, we're same basic nature, but we have such a different cultural outlook. I have a hard time believing that we would find sacrifices to be meaningful in a way that people during biblical times did. However, in order to change that, it would require Messiah or require some kind of direct prophecy. It may well be that that will happen, but we're not going to be able to just do it on our own. We're going to need to have a direct word from God that is going to tell us something like that. But for now, and this is what we're going to do in the coming weeks, we need to look at the sacrifices and see what messages we can gain from these various laws of sacrifice and ritual purity that may not have that much meaning to us today technically, but there are messages here that are truly eternal and have messages for us today. I'm sorry I went over time, but I hope you enjoyed. But I'm free. If you want to have any comments, that's great.
I have one question. This is Diane.
Hi, Dan.
I have read, and I may be wrong, about the implements and everything being prepared now for the temple, and that the priests have been training to do sacrifices. Am I correct or wrong about that?
No, yeah, they are not really practicing to do sacrifices, but there are definitely groups that are going back. The Talmud itself, by the way, takes these verses in Leviticus and discusses it based upon traditions that are very recent to the people of the Talmud, because their grandparents were actually doing sacrifices in the temple. Okay, so there's a lot written about the details and how things were done, and those chapters in the Talmud are studied today in a far more serious way than they were, let's say, 50 or 100 years ago. They are definitely preparing. What they have actually prepared, though, is the vessels in the temple, the menorah, and some of these other things that will be in the temple. That is something that they have been preparing for. Absolutely.
Thank you.
I believe the temple will definitely be built. No question.
Me too.
The only question is, will there be an altar or will be something else?
I agree. Thank you, Sondra.
Can I just
Thank
ask you a question, Sandra?
Sure.
Sandra, I've been reading Leviticus and are now doing Numbers, and I've been struck by God speaking to Moses and the long details. Now, we've just been doing a Lent course on prayer, and last night we were talking about listening to God. Well, I mean, if I've heard the actual, inaudible voice, it's always been quite short sentences. Now, how do you think Moses wrote all these things down? Because they just go on and on and on.
How did he write them down? I think, well, there are actually two theories. One is that he wrote it in bits and pieces throughout the 40 years. And don't forget, we're missing 38 years. Okay? The first 2 years after the Exodus are in detail until the sin of the spies. Okay? And then we jump in the middle of the book of Numbers, we jump to the last year in the desert. So we're missing all those years in the middle. So, that's a lot of time that Moses had to write things down. And it's also possible he wrote it at the very end, because at the end of Deuteronomy, it says he wrote down the book. And it's not clear, did he just write Deuteronomy at that point, or did he write the whole 5 books of Moses? But, you know, don't forget the things that God said to him, that only begins at the beginning of, in Exodus, really. But we still have a whole book of Genesis that was revealed to Moses some point, and he wrote that down as well.
And the other part of the question is, do you think you will get as clear details about the temple that you believe is going to be built?
Well, that's a good question, because we have the rules of the tabernacle is what we have here in Exodus. Solomon's temple was very different. We have details of Solomon's temple. Some of them are very hard to understand, but we do know it was very different. And then we have Ezekiel's visions at the end of the book of Ezekiel. That's even a different kind of temple. So who knows? Who knows? I personally don't think we should be building a temple until Messiah comes. And it's too complicated. Let him direct us on that one.
And Sondra, this is Maria speaking. Yes. I just recently heard about 2 days ago that there have been some most recent discoveries in archaeology. Book of Zacharias, some of the pieces have just been found. Have you?
Oh, I wasn't aware of that. It's very possible. Yeah. I haven't seen that. Yeah. That's very exciting. They're always finding new things, which is great. It's just absolutely fabulous. Anyway, okay, I'm going to let you go. I just want to wish. We're done. Yes.
It's going back to the sacrifices being pleasing to God and being a sweet smell. Yes. And I know in the New Testament, I'm not sure in the, Old Testament, in the Tanakh, if it says, but certainly God is pleased with our prayers. Yes. And they are like incense to him and a sweet smell. 100%. And prayers are sacrificial as well, aren't they?
100%. And in fact, in Jewish tradition, prayers are seen to be what took the place of sacrifices. And in fact, there is a verse, and I can't remember where it is, but if you send me an email, I'll send it to you, where it basically says we will pay with our lips instead of the bulls. I could find where it is, but that scripture is also seen to mean that your prayers, what you say with your lips, become the substitute for the sacrifices. And I think there's no doubt, if you go through the prophets, there's no doubt God wants our feeling. He wants our desire to sacrifice. He wants our obedience. He wants our faith. He doesn't care about the smell per se. Okay, he doesn't need that physical thing, but he's given it to us because that is something that is our way of coming close to him. And really the question is, well, is that still our way, or will there be a different way? But certainly the fundamental principles behind sacrifices are eternal and remain. Anyway, I'm just going to wish you all, anyone who celebrates Passover, have a wonderful holiday. And I will be giving a class actually next week, Thursday, which is right before Passover. So we will be able to say Happy Passover again then, next Thursday. In 2 weeks from today, we will not have a class because the reading of Leviticus is suspended. And 2 weeks from today, we're in the middle of Passover and we read something different. So we're not going to be having this class. Those of you, I would encourage you to get on our mailing list if you're not already. I think most of you are. And I put out taped teachings as well on the Torah portion. And I do have a taped lesson that I've already taped and will go out 2 weeks from today or 2 weeks from tomorrow that has a lesson about the reading we will do on Passover. So anyway, I will see you all next week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed that video, and we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below as well as on the notification bell, and that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you and have a wonderful day.